Hello and welcome everyone. I am Fernando Malgueiro, Medical Education Manager at 3M Medical Solutions Division, and I will be your host. I would like to thank you for joining 3M Healthcare Academy webinar titled Indicators of Safety, Chemical and Steam Indicators. This webinar presents crucial details that rely on the latest regulation, standards, guidelines, and practice in the United States as of April 2023. However, requirements may differ in other countries and US guidance may change in the future. Therefore, it is crucial to consult product instructions for use and abide by local laws and regulations. It is important to note that this presentation provides general information and shouldn't be solely relied upon for making specific decisions. We encourage all participants to engage with our speaker and ask questions by clicking on the question tab. We will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Sarah Cruz, a career strategist with her company Pretreat CSS. Sarah is passionate about helping sterile professionals reach their career goals through objective driving development. She is a published writer, mentor, and chapter president of the Connecticut Sterile Processing Association. Sarah is also an instructor at a local community college and a CS Quality Education Program Development Coordinator. She believes that technicians are the pulse of the hospital and is committed to bring the industry to the front line for success. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope you find this program informative and helpful. I will now give the floor to our speaker, Sarah Cruz.
Thanks, Fernando. Hello, my fellow sterile processing colleagues and anybody else who's joining us from the healthcare industry. Big shout out to any of the infection preventionists or nurses joining us today. We're going to be talking about indicators of safety, and I feel like sterile processing professionals are not the only ones who would find that interesting. Obviously, as you can tell by my name, I got a bunch of different letters after it. Just means I'm a CSS nerd. So I'm clearly interested in what we're about to talk about today. Frankly, I'm tired of the way we've always done it or talked about it in sterile processing. And it's my goal to help sterile processing professionals and anybody else who's interested really challenge the way that they help introduce new ideas and progress the industry as a whole. I am a professional development strategist. I am an industry writer and a columnist. I am the president and founder of Pretreat CSS, and I think Fernando did a phenomenal job introducing me, and I do want to thank him and 3M for hosting me on this amazing platform. With all that being said, all the opinions and views expressed in this presentation are of me, Sarah B. Cruz only, and they're not a representation of any of the companies or organizations that I associate with. But if you find that what I am saying resonates with you as a healthcare professional, I would love to advocate for you in that space. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me after the presentation, and please don't be shy. Use the Q&A box. I love talking to sterile processing professionals and anyone who's ready to engage in active solution-based problem-solving activities to really help our patient safety. Let's see. And don't forget that the platform that we are using today really takes this presentation away from the me just talking at you like an instructor and makes it a conversation. So again, don't be shy. And if you're a little shy, it's okay. We'll warm you up. All right. In the meantime, let's talk about what we're going to learn today. We will be identifying chemical and steam indicators. We'll also be able to determine the difference between indicators and integrators. Big thing. I called everything an integrator when I first started in sterile processing. I think I just liked how it sounded. We'll also be able to evaluate the use of chemical and steam indicators for sterilization. And lastly, we'll understand the class system used for types of sterility indicators. And no, I'm going to explain the word class and type when we get to that part of our presentation, but it's definitely a little play on words there. All right, without further ado, let's get nerdy. Let's get ready to set the sterile stage. And we are literally bringing it all the way back to our sterile processing 101. So when we are in the OR and the perioperative team are opening our sterile sets, I want to take us all the way back to the beginning that helps our OR professionals, our colleagues, really feel confident in what they're opening and what they're handing to the doctors, and then transcending that confidence to the doctors to use our instruments on their patients. So let's bring it back. Sterility 101. I know. Some of this stuff we haven't even talked about since we went to sterile processing school. And if you have just finished sterile processing school or you're just starting in your sterile processing career, feel free to leave a little note in the Q&A and tell me how many years you have, or have you only been on your job for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months? And then where are my OG real MVPs who sterile processing school wasn't even a thing at the time, maybe, right? And I know I personally haven't gone to sterile processing school in, well, me personally, in over 8 years, right? And then I teach it all the time, but it's quite different being in the seat. So I'd love to get to know my audience and my listeners that way too. But now taking it back to our sterile processing class, what is sterility? To simply put it, sterility is the removal of all microbial life, including spores. Now, when we learn about what cleaning is, physical and mechanical, what we learn about decontamination and high-level disinfection, it's all about preparing the instrument for its next phase of use or disinfection or cleaning, right? But when we get to the sterile aspect of sterile processing, this is the end of the line. The moment that those instruments go into that type of steam or chemical sterilizer, that's it. That's the last time we're going to see our instrument sets before they're being used on a patient. That's why every step leading up to the sterilizers are equally important. And the fight against microbials and bioburden is everybody's responsibility, not anybody else more in decon and not anybody less on assembly or prep and pack. It's an entire movement of professionals working together. Because when we put the instruments inside of those autoclaves, be it steam or chemical, we are fighting to create the conditions necessary to destroy spores. And in sterile processing, here comes the big word, ready? In sterile processing, we destroy Geobacillus thermopylis. Don't worry, you won't have to spell it, and you probably won't get quizzed on it later unless you're going to take your certification test. But why, up until this point, do we start using spores in our sterilizers to demonstrate sterility? Why are we throwing this big inclusive factor to the sterility program? Well, and that's because spores are technically the most difficult microorganism to destroy, right? They have this phenomenal ability to dehydrate themselves, really lower the critical needs, bring that level of homeostasis all the way down. They can live on the bare minimum, and just when you think you got them, and they're back, right? So we try to make sure that we're using a microorganism that we can eventually destroy if we have the right parameters and conditions set. And then we challenge our sterilizers to do and create those same environment necessary to destroy Geobacillus thermopylis. So a lot of the times when I teach, people ask, why don't we use prions? Well, these abnormal proteins are much more difficult to kill, and there's a whole bunch of different science behind it. And when we're testing for the viability or the accumulated lethality of our sterilizers, we want to use a viable microorganism that can actually be destroyed. Now, if you're interested in learning more about prions or different types of microorganisms, I am going to recommend that you actually watch 3M's Science of Speed continuing education available in their education vault. It's a phenomenal resource for biologicals and why spore selection was taken. And frankly, that presenter does a great job spreading that. But the FDA recognizes the accumulated lethality, the ability of exposure time and other parameters coming together to sterilize instrumentation in a way that even destroys spores. So that's only one part of our job responsibilities, right? All condensed into one small 101 slide. So let's talk a little bit more about what sterile lethality is and how we get along with this person named Sal. No, Sal and Amy, right? You can't escape them in sterile processing. But sterile lethality is broken up into viable aspects known as the sterile assurance level and log reduction. So your SAL levels, or your sterility assurance level, demonstrate the chance of spore survival. Now, in sterile processing, we operate under a 10 to the negative 6 SAL, okay, or your sterility assurance level. That means in a 1 in 1 million chance, there's a 1 in 1 million chance of an organism surviving the sterilization process, and 10 to the negative 6 is the lowest probability of spore survival. So that's why we're operating in that 10 to the negative 6. We demonstrate this using log reduction. And you can actually see that on the graph right here to the right, which I'll explain in just a moment. It's very colorful. I love it. But log reduction is the elimination of pathogenic bioburden. To me, all bioburden's pathogenic because I don't know where it came from. And frankly, I believe all humans are gross and anything that's left over from us is growth, right? But a pathogenic bioburden means a disease-producing bioburden. And I didn't realize it got worse than just bioburden, right? But in the validation process, log reduction demonstrates how valuable and practical the sterilization cycle is, showing the potential of the sterilization process. It also gives our manufacturers, right, the people making the autoclaves and all those IFUs, the idea of how impactful the sterilization process is on a product. So now take a look. Remember, we said 1 in 1 million of a chance, okay? So that's where you have, how many zeros are in a million? 6. So let's go up the scale. Here you have 1. Here you have none. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so eventually by the time you get to your negative 6 log reduction, your disinfectant effectiveness is high, and your percentage is even better for demonstrating and achieving quote unquote total sterility. Hold on to the fact that we operate under a 99.9999%, almost 100, but not quite 100. Let's take a look at why. And that's because we operate underneath something called sterility assurance. And the term assurance demonstrates the confidence or certainty in one's own ability, right? So that's what sterile processing does. What are we doing to make this declaration that, yes, we are confident that 99.9999% of the time, or there's a 99.9999% chance that there is complete sterility and destruction of all microbial life, including spores inside this set. And that's because we're working underneath the concept of probability. Okay, SAL, log reduction, whenever we're meeting terms and guidelines necessary to achieve sterility, we are working with probability. And that's the extent to which an event is likely to occur, measured by the ratio of the favorable cases to the whole number. So in plain English, if we do everything that we can and control all the variables that we can, our probability of achieving sterility is high, but still not 100%. That's because in sterile processing, we don't operate under this idea of a 100% guarantee. So even if we had SAL, good good old Sal, he went up to -8, -9. It would still never become 100%. It would just get that much closer every single time. Now, if you want to round up, you go for it. You do your thing. But if we're looking at technicalities in science, there's no rounding. And a guarantee is a formal promise that the certain conditions will be fulfilled. Now, we all know that with all the steps that occur in sterile processing, there is always there's always the probability that something couldn't be right. Right? So if the autoclave load comes out and somebody touches that wrap when it's still warm, making that nice little bridge for the microbials on their hands to go into the set, we did everything we needed to do before it went into the sterilizer, right? Still, we touched, we've lessened that chance for complete sterility, right? What happens if I don't know, unbeknownst to us, the steam quality isn't where it needs to be? Maybe our boiler water needs to go through conditioning. Maybe it needs to have some chemicals put in it. Maybe our drain line gauge isn't telling us what the appropriate temperature and pressure is. There's so many things that can happen that make us operate underneath a probability stance and not a guarantee. Okay, this is not like a used car dealership where it's like 30-day return policy, right? No return policy in sterile processing. You got to get it right, okay? So we operate underneath the sterility assurance and the sterility lethality to really help us understand Sterility 101. So as we talk about the different sincerities and levels of sterility, I want to talk about how we validate safety before we even get to the type of indicators that we use. Okay, we already learned the foundation. All right, we're like, okay, you took us back. We learned about sterility and how Sterility 101 works. But let's talk about the different ways we validate safety with our products. Now, when we think of monitoring sterilization, everybody jumps to a BI, right? Or a process challenge device. As I learned from my poll today, apparently everybody loves biological indicators on my LinkedIn. And they were very upset I didn't make it an option for people to pick. But there's 3 other groups that we utilize to monitor and challenge sterility, because that's the relationship of sterility. It's not just about watching it and creating the environment, right, for it to happen in. We have to challenge our devices to demonstrate sterility, right? So when we even get to the process challenge devices, we have different mechanisms in place that say, even if I give you everything you need, can you do what I need you to do? Yeah. So having a variety of ways to monitor and challenge our sterilizing devices to show that they're working is overwhelmingly important. Okay, so a lot of the times we forget about the administrative monitoring. And those are our policies and our procedures in our healthcare facilities. Okay, so all the policies that we have, the different ways we define wet loads, the ways that we list, hey, you have to take the autoclave out right, the autoclave chuck out right when it rings. All of these are outlined in our department policies, and sometimes even our healthcare policy, like our healthcare system policies. Okay, so let's not forget about the administrative work that comes in from these dynamic groups, your infection prevention group also. Another reason why sterile processing professionals should have a seat in this multidisciplinary committee. Another monitoring is physical monitoring. And I think a lot of the times we overlook it just because we're so used to having it. And also because a lot of us don't know how to interpret physical monitors. And a great example of that is your printout from your sterilizer. That is a physical monitoring device. So, you get your printout and you're supposed to look at it and you sign it and you date it or whatever the policies and procedures are in your facility. Some people don't even see their printout because it's all paperless and it goes right into their electronic tracking system. But when you look at that printout, do you understand what you're looking at? Do you know that you're checking for exposure time, dry time if necessary, temperature, pressure? Can you pick out where the pressure is happening and the pulses are happening demonstrated on your sterilizer printout? These are all abilities that come with interpreting physical monitoring. Now, the more popular ones, and where we will be spending our time in this presentation primarily, are chemical and biological. Chemical monitors are those internal and those external indicators and integrators that really come together to verify that the item has been exposed to one or more conditions necessary for sterilization. And I'm sure if you're a CSS nerd like me, you're thinking of all the different ones right now and you're picking out which one is your favorite, right? Just like we did with our favorite type of sterilizer. And last but not least, let's not forget about our biologicals, our process challenge device. They're intended to verify that the sterilization conditions within the load were adequate enough to kill a known number of bacterial spores. I want to talk more about the interdependent relationship of all of these monitoring devices throughout the rest of this presentation. Now, let's look at the function of our monitoring and our challenge devices. So we have our two, let's just pick steam and chemical, right? These are our two most popular modalities for sterilization, okay? So steam, you have your dynamic air removals and your gravity displacement cycles. I like to refer to the gravity displacement process as a very passive-aggressive process, you know, whereas dynamic air removal is doing those deep vacuum pulls and it's like almost like pulling it really tight and taking a deep breath and then pulling it even tighter. Whereas gravity displacement's kind of like, yeah, I know you're in there air, but eventually the steam will just push you all down to the drain and get you out of there, right? And then let's take a look at our different chemical options, okay? You have ethylene oxide, of course, low temperature hydrogen peroxide, and there's low temperature gas plasma. I think a lot of the times in these spaces, we like to call them SteriRad or VPro. Keep in mind that that's not a type of sterilization. Those are machine names, okay? It's low temperature hydrogen peroxide, low temperature gas plasma. But these types of sterilization have their own indicators, chemical and biological, that are designed to respond to their assigned sterility components only. I always find it interesting when the new technician comes up to me and they say, I put this in the hydrogen peroxide sterilizer and, see, I almost said it, and the tape didn't change. And I'm like, oh no, don't tell me I have to call the service person again. It takes them so long to get here. And right, you just go down that leadership cycle where now you got to call maintenance in. And then you look and it has steam tape on it. You're like, oh, and then you think back to the day when you did that, right? Because we all did that. We've all put steam tape on a chemical product and put it inside of the chemical sterilizer. We've all done that, right? And how many of us haven't really dried a product off and we put it in the chemical sterilizer and now it's failed, right? So hopefully you're not doing that with your ethylene oxide. That's a little bit more serious than a very obnoxious noise. But what the point I'm trying to get across is that while we utilize steam and chemicals, they have their own set of indicators that are designed to work accordingly in that space. Notice how I keep saying the word indicator. And as I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, when I first got out of sterile processing school and finally passed my test, that was quite the journey. I called everything an integrator. I don't know if I just liked how the words sound or if I really thought everything was an integrator, but it's like type 1 integrator, type 6 integrator, process challenge integrator. You know what I mean? So let me go over some of the differences between indicator and integrator. Now, an indicator visually confirms that an item has experienced a sterilization process. Okay, so it's going to be some type of chemical sterilizer, right? Some type of chemical indicator or coupled with a biological process challenge device. And it's going to visually confirm that an item has experienced a sterilization process. Whereas an integrator, while it does demonstrate that a sterilization process has happened, it demonstrates adequate or inadequate exposures to sterilization conditions. And there's a little bit of a difference between that, okay? There's a reason why a type 5 integrator goes into a biological process challenge device, okay? And that's because a process challenge device, which is designed to demonstrate that spores can be killed, that's it, nothing else about it, doesn't demonstrate sterility or probability of sterility on its own. So it needs to be coupled with a type 5 integrator. And I say integrator because that type 5, as you'll learn later, it covers a lot. I mean, it really puts in the work. It's not better than a type 1, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, but so an integrator covers a broader scope while an indicator lets you know that a certain process is happening. In fact, 3M published a study in 2005 to the American Journal of Infection Prevention, which is cited below if you get a chance to rewatch this presentation, that talks about the performance scope and the differences between an indicator and an integrator. So check out the link. It was very informative, and the AJIC or IP, the American Journal of Infection Prevention, is a very credible source for resources that they use a lot of the times that helps with regulatory creation and standard compliance language material. So if you'd like to learn more, you can check out that link below. So as we take the products that we use the most of in our sterile processing department, let's get ready to talk about assuring our sterility, okay? And I think this is what I like to refer to as the action part of our presentation. I know when I typically present, I like to do a lot of foundation building. Let's understand why we're here and what we're talking about. And then I like to talk a little bit about how we're going to apply this and where it's used in our sterile processing department. So now let's move into the part of the presentation that I enjoy the most, where we talk a little bit about action and what we can do as sterile processing professionals to demonstrate sterility and create assurance in our processes. This is where we really start to get engaged, and we can suggest process improvement or any of the different aspects that help assure our patient safety. Now, the best way to go about this is to understand how we use these process indicators or your chemical indicators or your process challenge devices, integrators, indicators. Let's talk about when they're actually used and how we can use them most consistently and effectively. So first up, let's talk about everybody's favorite, the process challenge devices, i.e. the biological indicators, BIs, whatever you want to call them, just don't call them positive for bacterial growth or spore growth, right? No, I'm just kidding. So when we use process challenge devices, it is challenging a multivariable aspect. So at this point, the little vial here has a version of the Geobacillus stereothermophilus inside of it, usually living in this bottom connecting aspect right here. Okay, so what we're doing when we sterilize a process challenge device is that we are putting it in the demonstrated parameters necessary to destroy microbial life, including spores. But we're going to give every opportunity for this spore to live. You say, why would we do that when we are trying to kill it? We're going to give it all the opportunity it needs to flourish, to further demonstrate that we have done everything we needed to destroy the spores with our autoclave and our sterilization processes. Okay, so the purple inside of this ampule, that's actually served as, I like to refer to it as like a food, right? It's like a food source. It's its medium that's going to help it grow. And that's why we use incubators as well. We use incubators. It's that nice, dark, warm, ideal environment where spores like to grow, and we're giving it its medium, its purple food, dare I say. And we're going to run it in the sterilizer. When you crack the top or you push in the top using your purple clicker, right? Remember, don't use your hands because you don't want the medium to get on your hands. That would, that's frustrating. But make sure you wear gloves and make sure you wear your PPEs and you use the appropriate crack. When you are pushing that top into the rest of the ampule, you're activating this process challenge device. You're releasing the Geobacillus steri up into the medium. And then you're putting it into its nice, dark, warm environment, and you're saying, grow. Now, depending on the type of incubator you have, it can be anywhere from 24 minutes. They used to have ones that took days. If you have one that only takes 24 minutes and within 24 minutes, you're going to have a positive or a negative readout. Now, if you have sterilized this process challenge device in the parameters as outlined in its IFUs, what it's cleared for, what's the exposure time, if there's dry time listed, what's the temperature, what are all those minimum requirements, you should get a negative sign on your incubator. I like to remember that for purple means negative, no microbial life. All right, negative, no microbial life. Now, as you can see, sometimes there's positives. Now, when you use these biological indicators, you have to do something called a control. Okay, so while we're incubating to mimic the ideal environment for microbial growth, we have to demonstrate that microbials will grow in this ideal environment in the first place, right? We can't just say, oh, look at how great our sterilizers are. We have to actually demonstrate that it's working. So you utilize the control in that way by doing the same thing you do with a process challenge device, but you don't put it in your autoclave load. You refrain from putting it in your autoclave load because now this spore has not been exposed to the conditions necessary to destroy it. So when you put it in the incubator, it comes out positive. And that medium, that purple, turns yellow, all right? So I like to remember it as yellow is positive for growth, okay? So instruments should not be released without a negative test result first, but when you're utilizing process challenge devices, whether it's every load or just on implant loads, you have to have a control of the same lot number to compare it against, just to make sure that our incubators and our processes are working the way they need to. Again, raising probability and demonstrating that our autoclaves are all that in a bag of chips, dare I say, and actually destroying microbial life. Now, moving to the chemical indicators, I'm going to move through 6 types of indicators. A huge thing I want to point out is that these are non-hierarchical. And when I say that, that means just because type 1 comes before type 2 doesn't mean type 1 is better than type 2. And just because type 6 is a higher number than type 1 doesn't mean type 6 is better than a type 1. Now, back in the day, we used to call these classes of indicators. We've since moved away from that to either further demonstrate the point that these are just types, and they, frankly, all work together in some type of dynamic to demonstrate and raise probability in our sterility and demonstrate assurance in our processes. Okay, so your type 1 are your process indicators. It's not uncommon to have that type of slip where you call everything a process indicator. I've seen it happen often where chemical indicators are referred to as process indicators, right? Specifically speaking, your type 1s are your process indicator. They demonstrate an exposure to a sterilization process. I also like to call them your physical indicators. These include things like tapes and locks, right? They're only going to change based on the type of sterilization or sterilant that they're designed to have, and they make some type of physical indication that they've come in contact with that sterilant, i.e. this 3M tape here will go from bare having the black lines that we've grown so fond of. Or you'll have this 3M tape here that starts off blue, and then when it's exposed, it'll turn yellow or pink, just depending on the product type. So type 1, super important, maybe your favorite, we'll find out. Then you have your type 2, again, not better than a type 1. I think the type 2s look cooler than the type 1s, but that's not necessarily fair. I digress. So a type 2 is used for a specific use because it's a specific test indicator. Now, the one we usually default to is your Bowie-Dick test. And while this is a test that helps demonstrate the mechanics of your sterilizer, it is not a mechanical test. And that's something I like to stress too, because remember, your mechanical testings are like your printouts. Okay, so the reason why your Bowie-Dick test is an example of a chemical indicator is because a chemical reaction is happening when the Bowie-Dick test is placed in the bottom rack, in the most difficult place to maintain, steam pressure, which is over the drain. I don't like to say in the front of the autoclave truck, because if you have two side loadings, steam sterilizers, the drain will be in the middle. So just make sure that it's placed on the lower rack above the drain, because that's the most difficult spot to maintain pressure in your sterilizer, because that's what Bowie-Dicks test for. They test for pressure maintenance, make sure that everything is staying nice and tight. And that's why we only use them in dynamic air removal cycles, okay? You don't need to run Bowie-Dick on a gravity displacement, because those deep vacuum pulls are not happening. So in this point here, it starts off as a completely different color. The chemical change is demonstrated in the pass or not demonstrated in the fail. So these are examples of type 2 chemical indicators. Type 3, no example for this one. Come with me on this trip. It's okay. It's mostly because type 3s aren't really seen in healthcare. All right. Type 3s are single variables, and they react to one critical parameter. And when we start to talk about single variables, like in type 3 and type 6, it's tempted to say, well, why wouldn't they be a type 1? The reason why it's a type 3 is because it's designed to act to one critical parameter, not that it's been exposed to a sterile process. Aha, see, there's a little, let me know if you need clarification on that, okay? But an example of this is in some labs, they have a pellet that they'll actually place, and it'll melt if the temperature is the right time. Like if the temperature is what's needed to melt it. So again, we don't really use it too often in healthcare or in the sterile processing department, but in some labs, they'll use melting pellets to demonstrate that whatever they're testing gets to the right temperature to melt that pellet. And then we have our type 4, which are your multivariable process indicators. They are internal and external indicators. Sometimes you'll see them on peel pouches. Here's an example of 3M's hydrogen peroxide, CH2O2. Oh, it's my favorite. So here you have an example with 3M. These type 4s are designed to react to obviously multivariable processes, but not all the processes. It's either like time or temp, or temp and pressure, or temp and sterilant. It's not really everything that makes up all the sterile parameters of a cycle in your sterilizer. And then you have what we've come to know and love as our type 5 integrating indicator. And I really like this reject accept line window, because the black line has the reaction inside of your steam. This one's made for steam. So it's having the reactor to the sterilant, and it shoots up and over. And as long as it's past this little white line here, it means that all the parameters were met in this integrating indicator to indicate that sterilization has happened, right? That, again, raising that probability, okay? This can perform in parallels with the BI, but it's not to be substituting the BI, because remember, this tests for all critical variables, but not the destruction of spores. That's why a type 5 is inside of a process challenge device. So they're buddies, they hang out. Okay. And don't forget, I know I've been utilizing steam for the past couple examples. These also exist for your chemicals. Okay. So hydrogen peroxide would look different. Ethylene oxide would look different. But again, still having that same type 5 capability with the sterilant of choice. And then you have your type 6. Now, these are what we like to call emulating indicators, whereas the type 5s are the integrating indicators. Type 6 really, they react to all critical variables that they're designed for. Now, they don't contain spores, so obviously they don't eliminate your PCDs or your biological indicators. They can work in conjunction with, but your type 6 is designed to act to very specific critical variables. So for example, an example of a type 6 indicator may be one that's designed to only change when 10 minutes of exposure time has occurred. That is a very specific niched variable that it's testing for. So if you happen to use a type 6 that was designed to have a 10-minute exposure change time only, and you put it inside of a 4-minute exposure load, it's not going to change. And it may look like your sterilizer load has failed. So that's just a baseline example of your type 6 emulating indicators. So in summary, sterility assurance levels and log reduction help demonstrate the probability of sterility. Remember, 99.9999, 10 to the negative 6, right? Don't forget to celebrate SAL on October 6th this year, right? We'll get a little nerdy together. It'll be great. Integrators may be indicators, but not all indicators are integrators. Okay, don't be like me and just call everything an integrator. Indicators/integrator types are non-hierarchical, but do have different purposes in sterility assurance. Just like how sterile processing professionals, infection prevention, and our perioperative partners all work together to get our patients home safely and infection-free, is the same way all of our indicators and integrators work together. You could have all the tape in the world, but it's not going to hit the same way as a type 5. And you can't get to seeing how your type 5 looked if your tape didn't change on the outside, because it's going to raise alarm. Yeah? So everybody works together. And process indicators work together as a tool to demonstrate that sterility parameters have been met during the sterilization process. So, in closing, I want to thank you all for being a part of this presentation today. I want to thank 3M for giving us the space to have this conversation and really take it back into demonstrating indications of safety and how we use all these different processes and products to help assure that our patients are going to have an SSI-free or surgical site infection-free procedure. And if you have any questions or concerns, don't forget to put them in the QA there. And if we don't get to them today, it's okay. We'll revisit them, and you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd love to help you all out with that. Thank you again.
I want to say a huge thanks to Sarah for that amazing presentation. Your expertise have been so valuable to all of us. We really appreciate your knowledge and giving us these tips and tricks that we can apply in our own work. Thanks again. Now it is time to open the floor for the Q&A session.
But so
before
excited.
that, you got a lot of questions, Sarah,
Oh, good.
including the comment in French. So,
yay!
yeah, yay. Well, as I'm in Canada, I would risk to say this is a indicateur d'intégration. Maybe I would call better in Portuguese, but never mind. So let's start with the first question. Why is it impossible to guarantee that something is completely sterile, even with rigorous sterilization procedures?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important question to ask because everybody wants to operate under a guarantee. There's a power in saying 100%. And I think that's something that's been ingrained in us, especially since we've been young when we take our tests and there's just something about coming home with an A plus or a 100% on our paper. And that really does demonstrate that we're grasping the subject 100%. There's no room for any misunderstanding. And the reason why we can't operate successfully in a 100% guaranteed space is because there will always be variables that add to the reasons why sterility isn't achieved initially or maintained afterwards. If you look at the conversation that's still happening between event related sterility and time related sterility, some of the policies say things like, well, it's sterile until it's used if the packaging is in appropriate condition. Well, what is appropriate? How are we defining appropriate? Does that mean wrinkle free? Obviously, it means no holes, but does that mean that it's in a special container? So the fluxing and the interpretive abilities, even outside of science, are too obscure to say, yes, 100%. Unless there's someone out there that can lead the charge on how we're going to define the word appropriately and then make it regulatory, there's always going to be standard interpretation based off of one's own interpretation and the facility's work group. And then when you start to bring science into it, we have to pull in the sterility assurance levels, right? And then you pull in your log reductions. So even when you look at your hand sanitizers that you use, we all used them during COVID, they were very popular, right? 99.99%. That's a sal to the -4 level. Okay. So even in a scientific space, you'll notice on the labeling, they'll never say 100% because there could have been something that happened before or after, whether you meant to or not. Maybe your coat rubbed against a sterile set while those pores were still dilated during the cooling phase. You know, maybe a fly landed on your set that you had no idea about, and who knows, right? If there's just too much happening in that space to confidently say 100%. It's more than just the rigorous testing that's happening. That's my stance on it. That was a really great question.
Thank you so much for answering. One more question. If we use a type 4 PO pouch,
Okay.
is necessary to put type 5 integrator?
Okay, perfect. Yes. So it is important to put a type 5 integrator in a type 4 because remember, the type 4 doesn't test for all the same things as an integrator. A type 4 is still listed as an indicator. Now, you could get clever with it and put a type 4 with a type 6, right? If you know what specifically you're testing for in that space there. But yes, you'd still need a type 5 with a type 4. And the type 4 on the peel pouch is really great because it sort of acts like how a type 1 would on our wrapped sets with tape or our locked sets or our rigid containers with the locks on it. So a lot of the times you'll go into facilities and they're still putting a piece of tape on and they're like, well, we just like to put the tape on it to make sure people can tell steam's touched it. The type 4 does that on top of that. But remember, you need an integrator with the type 4, and the same reason why your biological needs an integrator too. Good clarification question.
Awesome. We also got a lot of thank yous.
Oh.
Thank you. You are a great presenter. Love it. So, one more question. Are Boedics needed on tabletop autoclaves, air steam flush pressure pulse?
I saw that also. And so, without giving it away, I do. Okay, so I don't know if you guys noticed on one of the slides in the presentation, I did put a tabletop sterilizer on that. And that's because my next presentation with 3M will be all about tabletop sterilizers. There's an amazing presentation in between that Jen and Sarah are going to be doing that Fernando will tell you about. But I'm going to encourage you to come back and watch the tabletop sterilizer. Until then, sorry, I'm going to hold out.
Thank you, Sarah.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions.